in a small corner of her shabby room. Little Mary sat on the cold floor playing with her old doll. The pale light from the window barely illuminated her innocent face, highlighting the stark contrast between her fragile youth and the harshness of her surroundings. Despite the difficult circumstances, Mary was a child full of innocence and hope. The doll, with its loose threads and faded colors, carried the spirit of cherished memories and Mary's longing for her beloved grandmother. Mary sat in a corner of her modest room, holding a photo of her mother, whom she had never known. In the picture, her mother smiled warmly. Mary's eyes shone with a mix of sadness and hope as she imagined what her first embrace from her mother would have felt like. She looked at the photo with longing, wishing her mother could be there. Mary used to sit by her window, which overlooked a narrow street, filled with laughing and playing children while she was surrounded by faded walls. Her eyes held a mix of sadness and hope as she watched the children run freely outside. She felt the cold seep through the foggy glass of the window, but the warmth of the games and the laughter outside seemed to reach her heart. And after she finishes watching the children play in the street, she retreats to her room, sitting alone with her doll. Her eyes filled with tears and her face reflects profound contemplation and deep sadness. She cradles the doll, gently seeking solace and warmth in this harsh world. The cold touches her skin, but her heart is filled with a mix of sorrow and hope. Thoughts crowd her mind as she questions why her life is so different from that of other children. Why couldn't she play outside like the others?
In golden fields, I run so free. In this dream, I'm finally me. Oh, in my dream, I touch the sky. Laughter echoes, I can fly. This world so bright, where I'm at peace, where every hurt seems to cease. But night falls, the dream must end. Cold winds bite, no warmth to send. The flowers fade, the light is gone. Reality shadow lingers on. Old and alone, I face the night. Hunger knows no end in sight. Oh, can't you see? My spirits are not free, bound by chains, they won't let me be. Oh, in my dream, I touch the sky, bound by chains, they won't let me be.
My spirits are not free.
Mary often moved around the small living room, carefully wiping down the worn-out furniture and gathering dust from the neglected corners. Her clothes, tattered and torn, bore the marks of time and hard work. With an old broom in hand, she struggled to sweep up the dust that had settled in every nook and cranny, her small hands aching from the effort. Despite her young age, Mary took on the responsibility of caring for the house, determined to make the space as comfortable as possible. She hoped her efforts would bring a smile to her father's face, reassuring her that her hard work had not been in vain. After finishing her household chores, Mary slowly retreats to her small, cold room, sitting alone in the overwhelming silence. The small room was dark and cold, with worn-out furniture spreading a sense of despair. The walls were cracked from the passage of time. Mary's out wrapped in an old blanket, trying to warm herself beside the cold, unlit fireplace. She felt the chill creeping through every crack, and every breath she took carried a reminder of her loneliness. Life in their small home grew harder with each passing day. There was no food, no warmth, and Mary lived in this darkness and cold, alone, far from the comforting embrace of her grandmother's love. And whenever she felt lonely, Mary would go and hold the old dusty photo of her grandmother, her eyes filled with memories of warmth and love. She remembered the days spent with her grandmother, when the house was filled with love and laughter. After Mary's mother passed away, her grandmother had to move far away, leaving Mary alone. Her eyes reflected deep sadness and longing for those cherished days, knowing that the beautiful moments would never return, and that her ailing grandmother was so far away. She felt the cold touch of the photo beneath her fingertips, as if trying to grasp the warmth of the memories it held. She spoke to the photo as if her grandmother could still hear her.
Grandma, I wish more than anything that you were here. I need your strength, like only you could give.
Her grandmother had taught her everything about life and how to stay strong, but now only memories and an old photo remained. Her room was always dim and cold, filled with old furniture and stacks of ancient books surrounding Mary. She used to sit on the chilly floor, her eyes gleaming with passion and dedication as she pored over the worn pages. Her grandmother had always urged her to learn, reminding her that knowledge was the key to escaping poverty. As Mary read from her grandmother's old books, a faint apparition of her grandmother appeared beside her with the same kind smile on her face and eyes filled with wisdom. Despite the chill in the room, Mary felt a warm touch on her shoulder, as if her grandmother were truly there, guiding her and imparting her wisdom.
In the still of night, I close my eyes. Dreams arise like stars in the skies. A world where hope shines so clear, where I spread my wings, no fear. I see a schoolyard, fresh and bright, colors gleam and skies take flight. A place where my heart can soar, dreaming of a life with more. But as I dream, the darkness creeps. Hope feels trapped in shadows deep. Wishes fade like distant light, fading slowly out of sight. For can't you see, my spirit's not free, bound by chains, they won't let me be. These dreams are all I hold dear, but the world outside won't hear.
Mary remembered that she hadn't prepared food for her father, so she rushed to do so, knowing he would arrive soon. She went to the kitchen only to find it completely empty. Sitting in a corner, she thought sadly about how she could provide food for him. Hunger gnawed at her as she remembered that she had eaten nothing but a dry piece of bread since yesterday. Desperation led her to seek help from neighbors, a task that filled her with both hope and dread. Despite repeated rejections from them, Mary's spirit remained unbroken. She recalled her grandmother's words about an old neighbor who had always helped and loved her mother dearly. Determined, she went to him. He welcomed her warmly, giving her some bread, vegetables, and a small piece of candy, which she ate immediately, feeling immense happiness. Gratefully, she thanked her kind neighbor and hurried home to prepare a meal for her father. As she looked at the simple meal she had prepared, a small sense of pride welled up within her. She took a tiny piece of bread for herself, leaving the rest for her father. With a mix of hope and anxiety, she went to the window to wait for his return. The cold, dark room seemed to hold its breath, echoing her silent prayer for a moment of peace and happiness in their troubled lives. Mary stood by the window, her breath forming small clouds. On the icy glass, the street outside lay under a blanket of snow, dark and desolate. Inside, the room was just as cold and unwelcoming. Mary's eyes, filled with sorrow and longing, gazed out at the bleak scene, feeling the chill seep into her bones. She knew that one day she would have to face the harsh world, alone. As she looked out, she silently hoped to find something, anything, that could ease her suffering all the while, secretly longing to return to her grandmother's embrace. Someday. As she spots her father coming from afar, her eyes light up, and she whispers excitedly,
He's finally here. After all this time, he's really here.
Mary rushed to the door, her heart brimming with joy as she flung it open. The cold, snowy street framed her father as he stepped inside, but the warmth in her eyes met only his cold, distant stare. She reached out to embrace him, but he pushed her away with a rough motion, his face devoid of emotion. Mary stumbled backward, her joy shattering into sorrow and confusion. Without a word, her father moved to the table she had carefully prepared, placing a bottle of alcohol on it with a resounding clink that echoed through the silent room. He sat down and began to eat the simple meal she had made, his movements mechanical and indifferent. Tears streamed down Mary's face as she watched him, her eyes filled with sadness, disappointment, and a longing for the affection he withheld. The room, cold and dimly lit, echoed with the silence of her heartbreak, the distance between them growing with each passing moment. Mary sat on the cold floor in sadness, watching her father from afar. She saw his face lined with wrinkles, his bloodshot eyes from drinking, his disheveled hair and his dirty clothes. Since she was old enough to understand, she had seen him in this state. He was always angry and drunk, never appreciating her attempts to help. But she remembered her grandmother's words before she left for a faraway place, leaving Mary alone. Her father was not always like this. He had once been a kind-hearted man, loved by everyone with a promising future. And he had loved her mother deeply. Since her mother's death during childbirth, he had completely changed, becoming the man she now saw. Despite the harshness with which he treated her, she felt some sympathy for him. She wished she could have known her father before sorrow changed his features, and she longed to see her mother. The sound of her father banging his fist on the table snapped her out of her dreams and back to reality. The cracking of his knuckles added to the tension in the room. The house was dark and cold, the walls absorbing the despair that filled the place, as if her father's sadness had taken over everything. His eyes were red with sorrow, and his features were weighed down by defeat and despair. With a trembling hand, he gently handed Mary the box of matches, as if it was the heaviest burden he carried. Her small hands trembled as she took it.
This is our last box, Mary. Please don't come back until every single match is gone. Not one was left behind. Do you understand? Not a single one.
His voice was filled with sadness and helplessness, as if every word drained what little remained of his spirit. Mary felt the cold wooden box in her hand, its chill mirroring the coldness in her father's heart. He carried a deep pain within him, unintentionally holding her responsible for losing his wife, as if she had become a symbol of his suffering. Mary's eyes shone with fear, but within them, a new depth of empathy began to take root. As she reached out her trembling hand to take the box of matches, she felt an unexpected wave of pity wash over her for her father. His face, once strong and full of life, now bore the unmistakable marks of sorrow and defeat. Her heart ached as she recognized the weight of his grief, a grief that had turned him into a shadow of the man he once was. Despite the constant burden of her own suffering, the loss of her mother and the departure of her grandmother, Mary recalled her grandmother's last words.
Take care of your father as much as you can. He needs you now, more than ever.
At that moment, it was as if something had shifted inside her. Though she was just a child, her spirit aged with the weight of her newfound responsibility. Her small fingers gripped the cold wooden box tightly, feeling its rough texture, as a reminder of the harsh realities they both faced. For the first time, Mary looked at her father not with fear or resentment, but with a tenderness that seemed far beyond her years. It was as if she had become the mother, and he, the lost child, who now depended on her for guidance. The smell of sulfur in the box brought memories of warmth and safety, memories of her grandmother lighting the fireplace. Despite the fear tightening around her heart, Mary knew that stepping out into the street was no longer just a means of survival for herself, but a duty she owed to the broken man who stood before her. Mary took the box of matches and walked towards the door, her steps slow and heavy, as if each one carried the weight of the years she had spent within these walls. Just before stepping out, she paused and turned, taking in the house she had known all her life. The walls, once witnesses to the rare moments of warmth and joy, now stood as silent guardians of her loneliness, sorrow, and pain. Her eyes traced the familiar corners where laughter had once echoed, and tears had silently fallen. In that final, lingering gaze, she wasn't just saying goodbye to a home, but to the sorrow, the solitude, and the suffering that had taken root within its walls. The air felt colder as she breathed in, a chill that reminded her of the countless nights spent alone. Yet in her heart, she whispered a farewell, not just to the house, but to the burdens she had carried for so long. As she turned back towards the door, it was as if she had left a piece of her past behind, stepping into the unknown with the quiet strength that came from letting go. The cold was intense, and darkness had fallen on the last night. The streets were old and deserted, the buildings blanketed in a thick layer of snow, and the wind howled with a harsh chill. Snow fell heavily, and the little girl, dressed in ragged clothes, her bare feet sinking into the freezing snow, wandered the streets, alone, feeling cold, hungry, and tired. Her face bore the marks of exhaustion and hunger, her breaths visible in the frigid air. Mary's face was pale and exhausted, her long blonde hair encrusted with layers of frozen snow, and her eyes reflecting sadness and fatigue. She had walked for hours, clutching a bundle of matches in her hand, trying to sell them. The streets were empty and dark, and passers-by hurried along their way, without a glance, leaving Mary in her isolation. She felt her fingers numbing from the cold as she desperately tried to sell the matches, the biting air stinging her face. As Mary walked, she noticed a group of children, playing and laughing in a park. The trees were lightly dusted with snow, adding a magical touch to the scene. Mary stood by the park, her face reflecting longing and sadness, as she watched the children, with shining eyes, She smiled shyly, wishing she could join them, but her cold fingers clutched the box of matches tightly, reminding her of her responsibilities. She wanted to be part of their joy, but remembered she had to sell the matches to help her father. Mary closed her eyes and smiled warmly, her face reflecting the joy of her imagination. In her mind, she was playing with the other children in the park, the ball bouncing between them as they laughed and ran. She could feel the warmth of the sun on her face and hear the cheerful sounds of children's laughter filling the air. In her dream, the box of matches faded into the background, and the world seemed brighter and full of fun. She wished she could live in this fantasy, even if just for a few moments, escaping the weight of her daily responsibilities. Mary left her dream of playing with the children and walked on, her eyes lighting up when she noticed a kind-looking woman who gazed at her with compassion. The woman wore elegant clothes and held colorful candy in her hand. For a brief moment, Mary felt a spark of hope, thinking the woman might stop and help.
Excuse me, ma'am. Could you please buy some matches from me? It would mean so much. Why didn't she stop? Just for a moment, and she could have bought a few matches for me. All I wanted was a small piece of candy in return, just something so small. Was that too much to ask?
But as the woman continued walking without stopping, the cold air seemed to wrap around Mary once more, snuffing out the warmth she had briefly felt. Mary continued walking, feeling hungry and cold. Her eyes widened in wonder as she noticed a brightly lit shop window and moved closer to look inside. The store was aglow with colorful Christmas lights, and luxurious food was displayed on the shelves. Inside, a group of children gathered around a beautifully decorated Christmas tree, laughing and playing. Mary felt the warmth emanating from the shop, and the smell of delicious food filled the air, making her stomach growl with hunger. She wished she could be there, surrounded by her mother and grandmother in this warm and joyful world. Mary left the shop and continued walking through the cold streets, hoping to find someone who would buy her matches. As she walked, she spotted an old man. Bravely, she extended a match to him, her eyes shimmering with hope, her face reflecting deep pleading.
Please, sir, just one match.
The old man, dressed in a heavy coat and hat, his face stern and wrinkled, simply shook his head and walked away without a backward glance. Mary felt the cold air bite at her as she held out the match, her heart pounding with both hope and fear. She had hoped that this seemingly kind man would buy a match, but her disappointment was profound as he refused and continued on his way. Despair took hold of Mary as she looked down at her bare feet, her eyes filling with tears, her face etched with deep pain and hopelessness. The snow blanketed the ground, and the bitter cold air stung her skin, intensifying her sense of isolation and suffering. She felt the cold seeping into her bones, her bare feet nearly frozen from the harsh winter. Mary wondered how long she could endure the biting cold. Would she be able to sell any matches to save herself? Mary stood in the street trying to sell matches to passers-by in the bitter cold. Her eyes were filled with anxiety as she attempted to catch the attention of the busy people rushing by. The streets were blanketed in snow, and carriages sped past, adding to the chaos and isolation she felt. She wore a pair of slippers that were too big and had once belonged to her mother. They were no match for the freezing weather, and her feet were nearly numb. In the distance, a boy dressed in tattered clothes stood with a sly look on his face, his expression a mix of mischief and scheming as he watched her, intending to steal one of her slippers. Mary was looked completely absorbed in her attempts to sell matches. Her eyes, filling with tears, desperately tried to catch the attention of the busy people rushing by. The bitter cold seemed to pierce through her very bones, and the lack of customers made her task feel almost impossible. Each failure weighed heavily on her, deepening her sense of despair. But, as she always did in such moments, Mary escaped into her memories, places where hope still existed. She thought of the sweet candy her neighbor had once given her, and the memory was so vivid. She could almost taste its sweetness in her mouth. This small moment of happiness brought her a brief sense of comfort. While lost in her thoughts, she didn't notice the mischievous boy in tattered clothes sneaking closer. His eyes sparkled with mischief as he focused on the oversized slippers that barely covered her small feet. Suddenly, the boy shoved Mary hard, sending her falling, face first, onto the cold, unforgiving ground. He stood over her, a cruel smile on his face, laughing in a way that cut through the freezing air. Without hesitation, he grabbed her shoes, the only thing protecting her from the biting cold. Desperation filled her eyes as she looked up at him, her voice trembling.
Please, don't take them. I need them.
But the boy, unmoved by her plea, ignored her and ran off, his mocking laughter echoing in the empty street. Mary was left alone, trembling on the icy ground. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered in a broken voice.
Come back. Please.
Despite everything, Mary looked up at the dark sky, her eyes filled with hope and longing. The stars twinkled above, creating a beautiful contrast to the darkness surrounding her. She felt the cold air sting her face, but a warmth of hope radiated from within as she imagined living happily with her grandmother someday. She envisioned the moment they would reunite and how life would be beautiful with her. Mary's eyes shone with determination, her face reflecting both challenge and courage as she sat on the cold, snow-covered sidewalk. Passers-by hurried past without a glance, leaving Mary alone in the harsh night. She felt the chill of the sidewalk beneath her thin frame, and the cold air stung her face. But a warmth of resolve radiated from within. She felt sadness over her loss, but she knew that tears wouldn't help her. She needed the courage to keep trying. Despite the hardship she faced, Mary refused to give up. She knew life was harsh, but she was ready to face it with unwavering courage. In old, ragged clothes, Mary stood by the roadside in the cold, holding a bundle of matches in her hands. Her eyes were filled with tears, her face pale and etched with pain and despair as she extended the matches with trembling hands. The streets were crowded with people hurrying by, wrapped in warm clothes, not giving her a single glance. She felt the cold air piercing through her tattered garments and the gnawing hunger in her empty stomach, but she continued, trying to sell the matches. As Mary stood in the cold, her eyes filled with tears, she noticed a child buying candy from a nearby vendor. The streets were blanketed in snow, and the vendor stood under a colorful canopy, displaying an array of sweets. Children gathered around the vendor with joy. Mary's eyes sparkled with hope and longing, her face reflecting a mixture of desire and yearning. She felt the cold piercing her body, but the warmth of hope filled her heart as she watched the child buy candy. She dreamt of selling her matches, hoping to buy some candy for herself, to experience a simple moment of happiness. Mary didn't give up. She tried different ways to sell her matches, her eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and sadness. She smiled and called out kindly, but the cold wind swept her voice away amid the noise of the busy street.
Matches? Please buy some matches?
The passers-by continued on with indifferent faces, their expressions unchanging, ignoring her desperate attempts. The more she tried, the more their neglect deepened her pain, but she persisted, hoping that someone, anyone, would finally stop. After failing to sell any matches, Mary huddled in a corner between two tall houses. The long shadows cast by the walls made the place dark and eerie, intensifying her sense of isolation. She pulled her little feet under her, trying to escape the cold, but it was inescapable. Her eyes filled with tears, her face pale and exhausted as she shivered from the bitter cold. Mary's eyes shone with fear and despair as she looked around, her breath visible as white mist in the freezing air. She briefly considered returning home, but the thought quickly faded, fearing her father's wrath for not selling any matches. The house was cold and frightening, like a dark shadow, suffocating her. Returning to her father in disappointment was worse than the biting cold. Out on the street, the chill was unforgiving, but at least she was away from his harsh gaze. She grasped for warmth, but her frail body shook violently. The cold crept into her soul, wrapping around her like an unrelenting grip.
I just need a little warmth.
Her little hands were almost frozen. Mary thought of lighting a match to feel a bit of warmth. She hesitated for a moment, but then decided to strike a match to warm her fingers. The match produced a warm, bright light, like a tiny candle, casting a gentle glow on her cold, pale face. Her eyes reflected the small flame, and she felt a brief moment of relief as warmth seeped into her frozen fingers. As Mary struck the match, something magical suddenly happened. She found herself sitting by a large iron fireplace. The fireplace had shiny brass legs and intricate brass decorations that added a touch of elegance and warmth to the scene. The warmth felt so real and comforting that she instinctively stretched out her hands as if to warm them. Her eyes sparkled with happiness and a soft smile spread across her lips. For a brief moment, Mary felt the warmth of the match, as if it were hugging her. She closed her eyes, a soft smile spreading across her lips, her face reflecting peace and a fleeting sense of comfort. The warmth felt like a gentle embrace, reminding her of the love she longed for. But then the flame went out, and the fireplace disappeared. Mary's face transformed from happiness to sorrow and despair. Her eyes filled with tears as she watched the flame die. The cold air returned, piercing through her thin clothes, and the shadows once again enveloped her. She was left alone in the cold, with the remains of the burned matchstick trembling in her hand. She lit another match without hesitation. Its light made the wall appear transparent, revealing a room with a luxurious dinner table. The room was adorned with golden decorations, and the table was laden with delectable dishes. A roasted goose stuffed with apples and dried plums seemed to call to her, shimmering under the warm light. Mary's eyes sparkled with hope and anticipation, her face reflecting the deep desire for this beautiful scene to last just a little longer. Suddenly, the roasted goose jumped from the plate and started waddling toward her. Mary's eyes widened in surprise, a broad smile spreading across her face. She felt a warm sensation spreading through her body, and her laughter echoed in the cold air. But then, the match went out, and the luxurious dinner vanished, leaving her in the cold reality. Once again, Mary quickly lit the third match. Her eyes sparkled with hope and anticipation as the light revealed a magnificent Christmas tree larger and more beautiful than any she had ever seen, even more splendid than the one in the shop. The tree was adorned with glowing candles and colorful ornaments, shimmering in the warm light of the match. She felt the warmth of the candles fill the air, and the scent of the pine mixed with the fragrance of the ornaments, bringing her a sense of peace and joy. Mary saw thousands of candles burning on the green branches. The Christmas tree was adorned with countless twinkling candles and colorful ornaments, making it look like something out of a fairy tale. The little girl reached out to touch them, her eyes sparkling with wonder and a wide smile on her face. Just as her fingers were about to touch the magical tree, the match flickered and went out. The Christmas lights rose higher and higher, looking like stars in the sky. The clear night sky was filled with twinkling stars, and Mary spotted a falling star, leaving a glowing trail behind it. Her eyes widened in wonder and nostalgia as she remembered her grandmother's words.
A falling star, Grandma said. That means someone is going to heaven.
Mary's eyes shimmered with sadness as a tear slowly rolled down her cheek. She felt the cold night on her face, but the warm tears reflected the deep sorrow within her, thought the little girl, remembering her grandmother's words that a falling star meant a soul was going to God. Mary lit another match, and its light revealed her grandmother, looking radiant and loving.
Grandma, you're here.
Her eyes widened in astonishment and joy, and a broad smile spread across her face. Her grandmother's gentle features radiated warmth and happiness as she extended her hand toward Mary.
Grandmother, please take me with you. I can't bear this world anymore. There's no hope left for me. I can't do this anymore.
For the first time in ages, Mary felt overwhelmed by love and reassurance. Her eyes sparkled with warmth, and her face glowed with peace as if a heavy weight had finally lifted. She could almost feel her grandmother's gentle hand, warm and comforting, wrapping her in a sense of security. In that moment, all her fears and anxieties melted away, replaced by a deep sense of love and serenity, as if she had finally found her home.
I walk through the darkness, the cold kissed my skin, the hunger that whispered like a ghost within. Every step felt like a lifetime of pain, but I carried the hope that I'd see light again. Their eyes never saw me, their hearts never cared, but now I'm stronger, no longer scared. Now I'm breaking these chains, leaving the rain. No more lonely nights, no more endless pain. I'll rise with the sun where my dreams can breathe. With love by my side, I'll no longer grieve. I'm finally free, no more tears in my eyes. I've left all the shadows and touched the skies. The winds, they have silence, no more icy breath. The fear that once bound me now fades like death. I'll reach for the stars where hope has no end. With the love I have longed for, my heart will mend. No more hunger, no more fear in my heart. The chains are all gone, I'm ready to start now. I'm breaking these chains, leaving the rain. No more lonely nights, no more endless pain. I'll rise with the sun where my dreams can breathe. left all the shadows and touched by skies. The echoes of sorrow, they fade with the dawn. I've left behind darkness, I'm reborn. I'll dance in the sunlight, no fear in my soul. I'm whole once again, I'm finally whole. So goodbye to the chains, to the cold and the storm. I'm stepping into love where my heart stays warm. I'm finally free.